All right, I have to start off today's sermon with a confession. I put this movie on the summer schedule before I ever saw it. I like to at least do one children's movie during the summer, and so I needed to do some pre-planning, and so I went on the internet and I read a synopsis of the story. And because at that point I hadn't seen the film and didn't have any context for understanding it, I thought, well, this is weird. It talked about a mystical stone that was the heart of the island goddess named F.C.C. that was stolen by a sea demigod named Maui with a magical fish hook who was attacked by a lava demon named Taka. And now 1,000 years later, this small Polynesian island called Motunui is suddenly seeing its vegetation die and the fish becoming scarce. And the chief's mother says it's all because of Taka's darkness. And I wondered, what were the script writers smoking when they came up with this one? But then I pondered what I might think if I was an outsider looking in on Christian faith without any context for understanding it. Wouldn't the Christian story seem a little weird too? I mean, there's this peasant living in a backwater of the Roman Empire who goes around healing the sick and raising the dead and walking on water, feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he was executed, and then he came back to life, and we claim that we can still talk to him and he can talk to us today. You got to admit, on the face of it, it's a weird story. Western reasoning would say it's a fairy tale at best, a delusion at worst. Reminds me of my 3-year-old granddaughter, Claire, whose mother gave me permission to tell you about the time that Claire had some cards with various characters on them that were supposed to be used by children to make up stories. And so Claire climbed up in her daddy's lap with some of those cards and began, "Once upon a time there was a witch." And her daddy went, "A witch?" And Claire looked up at him and said, "It's just a story." It's just a story, nothing more than that, nothing to get excited about. And yet the place of story, I think, is crucial to the movie Moana. Granted, it's a cartoon, it's a kid's movie, but there's some serious themes here, crucial themes for us as Christians, even though the film has nothing to do with Christianity or any other religion for that matter. As the crops on the island of Motunui die, and the fish become harder and harder to find, the chief's daughter, Moana, suggests that they sail out beyond the reef in search of fish. But her father is adamant there will be no sailing away from the island. All boats are to venture no farther than they have before. It is forbidden to sail beyond the reef. The island can still give them everything they need, and that's that. And then Moana's grandmother shows her a secret cave behind a waterfall where there are dozens of boats rigged and ready for long oceanic voyages. Moana discovers that her ancestors were seagoing explorers, sailing all over the ocean, discovering new islands across the world, and the only reason they stopped was because Maui stole the heart of Te-Fiti, causing monsters to appear in the ocean. So her father's narrative of the people as a timid, landlocked tribe is not true. Her people were ocean-going travelers who could, once again, sail the seas looking for new resources, new lands, and new adventures. But someone must cross the ocean and return to Te-Fiti's heart. Gosh, I just can't guess who that might be. Of course, Moana chooses to make the journey. She rejects her father's story about who her people were in favor of the story she found in the cave, the story of a courageous pilgrim people who traveled the world to places unknown across the ocean. At its heart, Moana is not just another cute film about a plucky young girl who defies authority and accomplishes great deeds. It's really about choosing a story. choosing a narrative larger than yourself, placing yourself within a story that calls you to do something for the sake of others. Jesus put it this way: those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Now, I know the New Revised Standard Translation here is accurate, but in this case, I still prefer the wording of the old King James Bible. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? Soul is what we're really talking about here, not just life. The story in which you locate yourself is where you find your soul, that narrative that's bigger than yourself, that narrative that has a history, that narrative that is connected to others is where your soul is located. Now, we live in a soul-stealing culture. We live in a culture that preaches what one author called the gospel of self-fulfillment. This gospel tells us we can create our own story and create our own meaning out of thin air. As long as you follow your heart, as long as you follow your passion, happiness will come your way. Your life doesn't have to be moored to anything bigger than what's important to you. No wonder we have a society that's lost its soul. As I read the news, as I pay attention to popular culture, as I listen to people around me, I'm reminded of those 50-plus men at the end of World War II who came out of prison camps in Indonesia, all of them suffering from amnesia. They couldn't remember who they were, and there were no records to identify them. So a relief organization in Paris ran their pictures in a Parisian newspaper asking for anyone who had knowledge of these men to come to the city's opera house on a certain day. And on that appointed day, each soldier walked out to the center of the opera house stage, looked out into the crowd and pleaded, "Please, please, does anybody out there know who I am?" If you buy into this world story, you eventually wind up asking, does anybody out there know who I am? Now, the movie Moana sails dangerously close to those waters with all of its talk about following your heart. But thankfully, it doesn't sail off the edge. In one of the songs, the cast sings, "We keep our island in mind, and when it's time to find home, we know the way." We must have a story bigger than mere self-fulfillment. We need to be connected to a larger narrative. I love the story that the late Fred Craddock told about being in Israel, and he was being squired around by a private guide. His name was Jonah, literally Jonah. So one day Jonah took Craddock down to a side road, and they stopped at the bottom of a hill, and he said, "You see that hill?" Craddock said, "Yeah." He said, "Now our army was on the top of that hill, and the enemy thought we were on the other side of the hill. So when they came around to this spot, we jumped down on them from above and we killed them all." Craddock said, "Well, that's an interesting story, Jonah. Was that the war of 1948 or was that the war of 1967? And Jonah said, "That was the Maccabean War." And Craddock said, "But Jonah, the Maccabean War was 2,400 years ago. You talk about it like you were there." And with level gaze, Jonah said, "I was." Were you in the upper room? Were you at Golgotha? Were you at the empty tomb? Were you in the Roman Colosseum? Were you in the catacombs? I was. And so were you. If you claim to be a disciple of Jesus, you have to be connected to that story of Jesus and the early church. Otherwise, you lose your soul. Otherwise, you join the whimpering masses these days pleading, please, please, does anybody know who I am? 1 John 4 says, the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. In other words, you're already included in that grand story. You just have to make sure you don't get duped into believing a different story that's small and puny and self-centered and self-contained. That's why verse 1 of this passage beseeches us, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God. Does your story pass the 1 John test? I'm not talking about the personal story of the narrow parentheses of your birth and your death. I'm talking about that larger story that tells you who you are and what you're called to do at whatever stage of life you're at. The gospel story will call on you to commit to a task bigger than yourself, a task that makes a difference in the lives of others, a task that might not be terribly healthy. Are you willing, like Moana, to sail out over the ocean, not for the sake of personal adventure, not for the sake of personal fulfillment, but for the sake of a hurting, confused people whose story is so small, it's choking out their souls? Perhaps we should join Moana in singing, sometimes the world seems against you. The journey may leave a scar, but scars can heal and reveal just where you are. In 2004, the country of Ukraine was feeling the rumblings of unrest. Tired of authoritarian government and rampant political corruption, more and more people were speaking out and expressing their discontent with the system. And when the presidential election rolled around that year, an opposition leader named Viktor Yushchenko declared his candidacy for president. And thus began a horribly contentious, ugly, sometimes violent campaign. We thought our last presidential election was bad. It was a cakewalk compared to this. At one point, for example, Yushchenko fell gravely ill, and it was discovered he had been deliberately poisoned. For days, he hovered between life and death, and he managed to recover, but the poisoning left his face disfigured and jaundiced and bloated and pockmarked. Yet Yushchenko soldiered on. On November 24th, Election Day, all non-government polls showed Yushchenko comfortably ahead of the ruling party candidate, and most people expected him to win. But the principalities and powers of Ukraine, of course, were not about to give up so easily, and so they went in and they tampered with the election results. Soon people all over Ukraine turned on their TV sets and saw a reporter on the government-run station declare, "Ladies and gentlemen, we announce that the challenger, Viktor Yushchenko, has been decisively defeated." But down in the lower right-hand corner of the TV screen, there was an inset for a sign language interpreter named Natalia Dimitruk. It was her job to translate the government's words into sign language for the deaf. The only problem was that Dimitruk knew the truth. She knew that the ruling party had doctored the election results. And so while the camera focused on the reporter regurgitating the government's falsified claptrap, the ruling party was completely unaware that Dimitruk, down in the right-hand corner of the screen, instead of translating the reporter's words, was signing instead, "I am addressing everybody who's deaf in Ukraine. Our president is Viktor Yushchenko. Do not trust the results of the Central Election Committee. They are all lies, and I am ashamed to translate such lies to you." Well, the deaf community sprang into high gear. All over Ukraine, they text message their hearing friends about the fraudulent election results. And as news spread, journalists, even at the state-run media, refused to parrot the party line anymore. Hundreds of them confronted the network owners chanting, "No more lies, no more lies." 1 million people wearing the color orange, the official color of Yushchenko's party, spilled into the streets of the capital city of Kiev, demanding a new election. And over the coming weeks, the so-called Orange Revolution dislodged the oligarchs and installed Yushchenko through another election, this one declared by all observers inside and outside the country to be free and fair. And all of it, because one woman had the guts to tell a different story. Oh, my sisters and brothers, look around you at the story we're told to embrace every day. Washington, Wall Street, Main Street, and Hollywood all want us to locate ourselves in a story where rich people matter, where beautiful people matter, where powerful people matter, where winners matter, where the one who dies with the most toys wins matters, where second place is the first loser, where war is the only path to peace and consumption is the gateway to happiness. But down in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, there's someone named Jesus who says, the story they're telling you is a lie. It's the poor who are blessed, not the rich. Mourners are blessed too, as well as those who hunger and thirst. It's the persecuted who are blessed, not the comfortable. Those who think they're on top will wind up on the bottom, and those who think they're on the bottom will wind up on top, because what will it profit you to gain the whole world and lose your own soul? Just a story. No. It's the story.